It all began on a cold, unassuming Friday afternoon in March, a day that would forever alter the course of my life. I had finished work early, something rare for me, and decided to surprise Emma with her favorite takeout. The drive home felt normal, almost serene, as if the universe was mocking me by delaying the inevitable storm. When I walked into her apartment, the air felt unnervingly still, like the calm before a hurricane. Her shoes were by the door, but there was no sound except for faint laughter drifting from the bedroom. My stomach tightened, an instinctive warning that something was horribly wrong. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to call out or investigate further. But curiosity or perhaps dread pulled me toward the bedroom door. What I saw next shattered every fragment of trust, love, and hope I'd ever held onto. There they were, Dylan, my own brother, and Emma, the woman I planned to marry, tangled up in bed together. It wasn't just the sight of them, it was the details that made my blood boil. Emma was wearing the oversized t-shirt I'd given her for Valentine's Day, the one with the cheesy heart print. It was supposed to symbolize our love, not their betrayal. And then, as if the scene itself wasn't devastating enough, my eyes caught sight of Dylan's phone lying carelessly on the nightstand. A series of notifications lit up the screen, each one a dagger to my heart. They weren't new messages, they were weeks, maybe months old. Flirty texts, inside jokes, even plans to meet when I was out of town. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment mistake. This was a calculated affair, a slow poison they had been feeding into my life without remorse. The silence between us was deafening, suffocating. For a brief second, neither of them moved, frozen like deer caught in headlights. Then Emma scrambled to cover herself with the blanket, her face flushed with shame or maybe fear. She opened her mouth to speak, her voice trembling as she tried to explain. "Alex, it's not what it looks like. He forced her." The words hit me like a slap, but before I could react, Dylan interrupted, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Don't lie, Emma," he said, smirking at me. "You wanted this. You chose me over him." His words were like gasoline poured over an open flame. How dare he? How dare they both sit there, naked and unapologetic, acting as though they hadn't just destroyed everything I valued. My mind raced, trying to process the magnitude of their betrayal. Not only had they slept together, but they had conspired behind my back, laughing at my expense while pretending to care about me. The audacity of Dylan's smirk, the casual way he admitted to winning Emma, was too much to bear. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to unleash the rage building inside me. But instead, I stood there, eerily calm, staring at them with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "Pack your things and get out," I finally said, my voice low and steady, cutting through the tension like a knife. Emma looked at me, her eyes wide with panic, but I didn't give her a chance to respond. Turning to Dylan, I added, "You're dead to me." His expression faltered for a split second, but I didn't wait for him to reply. I grabbed my keys and stormed out, leaving behind the ruins of what was once my future. As I drove aimlessly through the streets of Milwaukee, the reality of it all began to sink in. My fiancée, the person I trusted most in the world, had betrayed me not with a stranger, but with my own brother. The weight of their deceit crushed me, leaving me hollow and broken. The aftermath of that fateful Friday was nothing short of a war zone in my parents' house. The news of Dylan and Emma's betrayal spread like wildfire, though I never uttered a word about it to anyone. Knowing my mother, Claire, she must have gotten the details directly from Dylan or Emma themselves, probably in some pathetic attempt at self-preservation. When she called me later that evening, her voice wasn't filled with concern for me. Instead, it was laced with fury aimed squarely at Dylan. "How could he do this to you?" She screamed into the phone, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "He's not welcome here, not after what he's done." For a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel relief. At least someone understood the gravity of what had happened. But as days passed, cracks began to form in her facade of outrage. One night, while I was still reeling from the betrayal, I received another call from her. This time, however, her anger wasn't directed at Dylan, it was aimed at me. "You need to forgive him, Alex," she said, her voice trembling but firm. He's your brother, family comes first. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. How could she expect me to simply erase the image of Dylan and Emma together? Did she think forgiveness was a magic eraser for their sins? But the real shock came just weeks later when I visited the house to pick up a few belongings I'd left behind. As I walked through the door, I heard laughter echoing from the kitchen, a sound so jarring it made my skin crawl. There they were, Dylan sitting comfortably at the table, sipping coffee, and my mom bustling around like nothing had changed. She greeted me with an awkward smile, pretending everything was normal. Alex, good timing. We were just having breakfast," she chirped, as if inviting the man who destroyed my life back into her home was the most natural thing in the world. My blood boiled. "What is he doing here?" I demanded, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. My mom placed a hand on my shoulder, her expression softening into what I can only describe as manipulative sweetness. "Honey, we're a family. Families forgive each other. Dylan made a mistake, but he's learned from it." A mistake? Was she serious? Betraying your own brother wasn't a mistake, it was a calculated act of cruelty. Before I could respond, Dylan chimed in, his voice dripping with false remorse. "I'm sorry, Alex. It won't happen again." "Sorry," I spat, incredulous. "Do you even hear yourself? You don't get to say sorry and act like it fixes everything." My outburst did little to faze him or my mom, for that matter. Instead, she doubled down, insisting that holding on to my anger would only tear the family apart. "You're being too rigid, Alex," she said, her tone condescending. "Life isn't black and white. Sometimes you have to let things go." If my mother's reaction felt like a betrayal, my father's indifference was a knife to the heart. Joe had always been the type to avoid conflict, preferring jokes and grilling steaks over addressing real issues. But his response to the situation went beyond mere avoidance, it bordered on dismissive. When I finally answered one of his calls, he didn't ask how I was coping or express any sympathy for what I'd endured. Instead, he sighed heavily and said, "Well, these things happen, Alex. You've got to learn to move on." "These things happen," I repeated, my voice rising. "Dylan slept with my fiancée, Dad. He betrayed me in the worst possible way. And you're acting like it's no big deal." His lack of empathy stunned me. "Look," he continued, his tone tinged with irritation, "people make mistakes. Remember when Mia accidentally broke your bike when you were kids? You forgave her then, didn't you?" Comparing Dylan's betrayal to a childhood accident was beyond insulting. It minimized the depth of his actions and made me feel like my pain was insignificant. The tension between us grew unbearable. Every conversation ended the same way, my parents pressuring me to forgive Dylan, while I refused to budge. They acted as though forgiveness was a transaction, one where I sacrificed my dignity and sanity for the sake of keeping the family intact. What they failed to understand was that forgiving Dylan meant condoning his behavior, and I couldn't live with that. Each plea from my mom, each dismissive comment from my dad, chipped away at whatever remained of my trust in them. By the time I moved to Indianapolis, I knew the rift between us was irreparable. They had chosen Dylan over me, and there was no going back. The decision to leave Milwaukee wasn't just about escaping the suffocating weight of betrayal, it was about survival. Every street corner, every coffee shop, and every park bench reminded me of Emma and Dylan, their laughter, their lies, and ultimately, their treachery. Indianapolis became my lifeline, a place where no one knew my name or the wreckage I left behind. But cutting ties with my family proved far more complicated than simply packing up and moving away. My mother, Claire, didn't take rejection lightly. In fact, she turned into someone unrecognizable, a relentless force determined to drive me back into the chaos I so desperately wanted to escape. It started with phone calls. At first, they were sporadic, her voice trembling as she begged me to reconsider. "You're tearing this family apart, Alex," she'd say, her tone oscillating between desperation and accusation. "How can you be so selfish?" Selfish? The irony burned like acid in my throat. She accused me of being selfish while simultaneously welcoming Dylan back into her home without hesitation. As weeks passed, her calls grew more frequent, more desperate, and increasingly manipulative. One night, After a particularly grueling day at work, I picked up the phone only to hear her sobbing uncontrollably. "Do you hate us that much?" she cried. "Is this what you want, to destroy everything we've built?" Her words felt like daggers, but not because they hurt. They infuriated me because they twisted reality, painting me as the villain for refusing to forgive the unforgivable. And then came the texts, dozens of them, each one more toxic than the last. Some were veiled threats: "If you don't come back, none of us will ever forgive you." Others were outright accusations: "This is your fault, Alex. You pushed Dylan away. You drove him to this." Each message chipped away at whatever shred of patience I had left. I blocked her number multiple times, but she always found new ways to reach me: burner phones, emails, even messages through mutual friends. It was exhausting, maddening, and utterly relentless, but nothing prepared me for the ambush that followed. A few months after settling into Indianapolis, I ran into Dylan completely by chance, or so I thought, at a local cafe near my office. He was sitting at a table, scrolling through his phone, looking casual as if he belonged there. When he spotted me, his face lit up with an unsettling grin. "Alex, what are the odds?" he said, standing up as if we were old buddies meeting for coffee. For a moment, I considered walking out, but curiosity got the better part of me. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice cold enough to freeze fire. "Oh, I'm helping out with a project downtown," he replied smoothly, gesturing vaguely toward his laptop. Thought I'd grab a bite before heading back. His explanation sounded plausible on the surface, but something about his demeanor set off alarm bells in my head. Why would Dylan, who hadn't worked a day outside of manual labor in years, suddenly show up in Indianapolis under the guise of business? As we stood there awkwardly, he shifted gears, his tone softening as though he were about to deliver some heartfelt confession. "Listen, man, I know things have been rough between us," he began, his voice dripping with false sincerity, "but I miss having my brother around. We used to be close, remember? Can't we put all this behind us?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut, not because they carried any weight, but because they revealed his true intentions. This wasn't about reconciliation. It was about manipulation. He wasn't here for business. He was here on a mission orchestrated by my mother to guilt-trip me into forgiving him. My fists clenched involuntarily, and I could feel the blood rushing to my face. "Don't you dare try to play the victim," I snapped, my voice low but seething with anger. "You betrayed me in the worst possible way, and now you think showing up here with your fake apologies is going to fix anything? Get out of my sight." Dylan's expression faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered, raising his hands defensively. "Well, okay, no need to get hostile. I'm just trying to make things right. Make things right," I repeated incredulously, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay composed. "There's no making things right when it comes to sleeping with your brother's fiancée. You destroyed my life, Dylan, and now you're using this pathetic excuse of work to worm your way back into mine." By this point, several patrons had turned their heads, watching the escalating confrontation with wide eyes. Dylan glanced around nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Look, maybe this isn't the best time to talk," he muttered, gathering his things hastily. "But think about what I said, all right?" I wanted to lunge at him, to let my rage explode in a way I hadn't allowed myself since discovering his betrayal. But instead, I took a step back, breathing heavily as I fought to regain control. "Get out," I growled, pointing toward the door. "And don't you dare come near me again." He hesitated for a moment, then scurried out of the cafe like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. Watching him go, I realized how calculated their tactics were. My mother and Dylan weren't giving up, they were doubling down, using every trick in the book to break me. But I refused to let them win, not anymore. The attempts to reunite me with Dylan and Emma didn't stop after that disastrous birthday ambush. If anything, they grew more calculated, more desperate, as though my family believed sheer persistence would wear me down. They underestimated how deeply their betrayal had scarred me and how far I was willing to go to protect myself from their manipulation. It all came to a head one December evening, just days before Christmas. My mom called me repeatedly throughout the week, her voice dripping with forced cheerfulness. "Alex, it's been too long since we've seen you," she pleaded during one call. "We're having some friends over for dinner, just a small get-together. You remember Sarah, don't you? She's back in town and misses everyone so much." The mention of Sarah caught my attention. She was the distant cousin who had unwittingly lured me into another trap months earlier. Despite my lingering suspicion, something about her name tugged at me, not out of nostalgia, but guilt. Was this really her doing again, or was she being used once more as bait? Against my better judgment, I agreed to show up, telling myself it might be harmless enough. After all, what harm could come from seeing old acquaintances? But the moment I pulled into the driveway, dread washed over me like ice water. There were far too many cars parked outside for this to be a casual gathering. As I stepped inside, the scene hit me like a freight train. A massive banner hung across the living room wall, its bold letters screaming, "We are family." And there they were, Dylan and Emma, sitting comfortably on the couch as if nothing had ever happened. Even worse, Mia stood nearby, holding a tray of appetizers, her expression sheepish yet guilty. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice low but sharp enough to cut through the awkward chatter filling the room. Before anyone could answer, my mom rushed toward me, arms outstretched in an exaggerated display of affection. "Alex, we knew you'd come around eventually," she exclaimed, pulling me into an unwanted hug. Her tone was triumphant, as though she'd orchestrated the perfect plan to mend our fractured family. I pushed her away gently but firmly, my eyes darting between Dylan and Emma. "You think this is funny, inviting me here under false pretenses?" I turned to Mia, whose face flushed red. "Did you know about this?" "I thought," she stammered, unable to meet my gaze. "Mom said it would help." "Help?" I snapped, incredulous. "This isn't helping, it's gaslighting. Did any of you even consider how I'd feel walking in here and seeing them?" I pointed accusingly at Dylan and Emma, who exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. Their silence infuriated me further. How dare they sit there, acting as though their presence wasn't a slap in the face? Before things escalated further, my dad intervened, his tone condescending as always. "Come on, Alex. Can't you let bygones be bygones? It's Christmas, for crying out loud." "Christmas," I repeated, my voice rising. "You think a holiday magically erases everything they've done? This isn't about forgiveness, it's about accountability. And neither of you seem capable of understanding that concept." The argument spiraled from there, with my mom sobbing hysterically and Dylan attempting another insincere apology. I didn't stay to hear it. Grabbing my coat, I stormed out, slamming the door behind me. That night solidified something deep within me. No matter how hard they tried, I would never allow myself to be manipulated back into their toxic orbit. But they weren't done yet. Weeks later, Mia reached out to me again, this time using a tactic so manipulative it left me reeling. She sent me a text late at night, her words frantic. "Alex, please come quick. Something's wrong. I'm in the hospital." Panic surged through me. For all her flaws, Mia was still my sister, and the thought of her suffering was unbearable. I raced to the address she provided, only to find her sitting calmly on the couch when I arrived. "What the hell is going on?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger and relief mixed together. She looked up at me, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Alex. I didn't mean to lie, but Mom said you wouldn't come otherwise. She just wants us to talk, to fix things." Her confession felt like a punch to the gut. Not only had they stooped to exploiting my concern for Mia, but they had also dragged her into their schemes. I couldn't decide whether to feel angrier at them or pity her for becoming complicit in their games. Either way, I walked out without another word, vowing never to trust anything they said again. Settling into Indianapolis was supposed to be my fresh start, a chance to leave behind the wreckage of betrayal and rebuild a life on my own terms. But healing isn't linear, and just when I thought I was finally free from their toxic orbit, a single message shattered the fragile peace I had worked so hard to construct. It came late one evening, almost as if timed perfectly to catch me at my weakest moment. A mutual acquaintance, someone I barely remembered, sent me a photo via text. At first glance, it seemed innocuous enough. Dylan and Emma sitting together in what looked like a cozy cafe, smiling for the camera. The caption beneath the image read, "They're still very much in love." The words hit me like a freight train, derailing every ounce of progress I'd made. For weeks after discovering Dylan and Emma's affair, I had convinced myself that cutting ties with them and by extension, my entire family was the right decision. I told myself repeatedly that they weren't worth my energy or tears. Yet here was proof that not only had they moved on effortlessly, but they were thriving without me. They didn't carry the guilt or shame I assumed would haunt them forever. Instead, they flaunted their happiness, broadcasting it to anyone who cared to look. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with images of them laughing together, planning some future I wasn't part of anymore. Every memory we once shared felt tainted now, rewritten through the lens of their betrayal. I spiraled into a brief depression, unable to focus on work or even muster the will to get out of bed. The weight of their actions pressed down on me, heavier than ever before. It wasn't just anger, it was grief. Grief for the life I lost, the trust I misplaced, and the naive belief that people could change. To make matters worse, starting over in Indianapolis wasn't as smooth as I'd hoped. Financial struggles compounded my emotional turmoil. Rent in the city was higher than expected, and finding steady clients proved challenging. There were days when I questioned whether leaving Milwaukee had been the right choice. Was this new life really better, or was I simply trading one kind of pain for another? Then Hannah walked into my life, or rather, stumbled into it during an awkward coffee run. She was different from anyone else I'd met, kind but firm, empathetic yet unafraid to challenge me when necessary. When she noticed how withdrawn I'd become, she didn't push for details immediately. Instead, she offered quiet support, inviting me to join her for small outings or simply sitting beside me while I stared blankly at walls. Over time, she became my anchor, the person who reminded me that moving forward didn't mean forgetting, it meant choosing survival over despair. One particularly rough day, after receiving another passive-aggressive email from me about how everyone misses you, Hannah sat me down and said something I'll never forget. "You can't control what they do, Alex, but you can decide how much power you give them over your life." Her words struck a chord deep within me. Slowly, I began to channel my frustration into action. I took on extra projects at work, poured myself into networking events, and eventually landed a contract that helped stabilize my finances. Each step forward felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, one that Dylan and Emma had tried to destroy. Still, there were moments when doubt crept back in. Like the time I accidentally ran into Sarah again at a local grocery store. She approached me hesitantly, clutching a bag of groceries like a shield. "I'm sorry about everything," she murmured, avoiding eye contact. I didn't know. I wouldn't have helped them if I did. Part of me wanted to believe her, but the other part knew better. People always say they're sorry after the damage is done. What mattered most was that I no longer owed them anything, not explanations, not forgiveness, not even acknowledgement. By the time winter rolled around, things started looking up. I found stability in both my career and personal life. Hannah and I grew closer, her unwavering support giving me strength I hadn't realized I needed. Together, we navigated the challenges of building a life far removed from the chaos I left behind. And though shadows of my past occasionally lingered, they no longer defined me. I was learning to live, not just survive. The unraveling of Dylan and Emma's seemingly perfect life wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. Karma, as they say, has a way of catching up with you when you least expect it, and for them, the descent into chaos began subtly at first. It started with missed rent payments. Their once cozy apartment in Milwaukee, the same one I had walked out of after discovering their betrayal, became a battleground between them and their landlord. At first, eviction notices were ignored, then came the locks being changed without warning. By the time winter rolled around, they were officially homeless, bouncing from couch to couch among friends who grew increasingly tired of their excuses. It wasn't just financial ruin that plagued them, it was their behavior. Dylan's charm, which had once been his greatest asset, turned sour under pressure. He became moody, irritable, and prone to lashing out at anyone who dared question his decisions. Emma, on the other hand, retreated into herself, her confidence shattered by the weight of guilt and failure. Friends stopped inviting them over. Acquaintances avoided answering their calls. The very people they thought would always have their backs began distancing themselves, leaving Dylan and Emma more isolated than ever before. They weren't just drowning financially, they were drowning socially, emotionally, and morally. Meanwhile, Mother Claire's world crumbled around her. For years, she prided herself on keeping our family together, no matter the cost. But now, her efforts seemed futile, even laughable. Her iron-willed facade cracked under the strain of separation from my father Joe, who moved into a tiny rental unit far from the house where we'd grown up. The grand family dinners she used to orchestrate, gone. The laughter echoing through the halls, replaced by silence. Claire tried desperately to maintain appearances, hosting small gatherings and pretending everything was fine, but everyone could see through her act. She was alone, truly alone for the first time in decades. And yet, despite all this, she refused to let go of the past. Late-night phone calls became her weapon of choice, her voice trembling with desperation as she begged me to return home. "Alex, please," she'd whisper, her tone heavy with tears. "I can't do this anymore. You're all I have left." Her words stung, not because they held any truth, but because they revealed how blind she still was to the reality of what she'd allowed to happen. In her mind, forgiveness was a magic eraser that could wipe away betrayal, deceit, and pain. To her, my absence was the problem, not Dylan and Emma's actions, not her own complicity in enabling their destruction. One particular call stands out vividly in my memory. It was 2 a.m., and her voice sounded weaker than usual. "I sold your grandmother's necklace today," she admitted, choking back sobs. "I didn't know what else to do. The bills. They're piling up so fast." My stomach churned at the thought of her parting with something so precious, a family heirloom passed down for generations. Yet, instead of feeling sympathy, I felt anger. Why should I care about her struggles when she chose to prioritize Dylan over me? When she welcomed him back into her home while treating my pain like an inconvenience? As weeks turned into months, the updates trickled in sporadically through mutual acquaintances or Mia, though I rarely responded to her messages anymore. Apparently, Dylan and Emma's situation worsened. Rumors spread that Emma lost her job after clashing with coworkers, unable to hide her bitterness and resentment. Dylan's freelance gigs dried up entirely, leaving him scrambling for odd jobs that barely covered groceries. Their relationship, already strained, teetered on the brink of collapse. Arguments erupted daily, loud enough for neighbors to hear. Some said Emma threatened to leave multiple times, only to stay out of fear of having nowhere else to go. Claire, meanwhile, spiraled further into despair. Once proud and unyielding, she now appeared frail and defeated. Neighbors whispered about seeing her sell off pieces of furniture, jewelry, and even her cherished antique china set. Each item represented another piece of her crumbling dignity. And still, she called me, her pleas growing more frantic with each passing week. "You don't understand, Alex," she cried during one particularly heated conversation. "They need us. We're all they have." "They made their bed," I shot back coldly. "Let them lie in it." Her silence afterward spoke volumes. For the first time, perhaps, she realized the depth of her mistakes, the consequences of choosing loyalty to Dylan over justice for me. But it was too late. The damage was done, and no amount of begging or selling heirlooms could undo it. As much as I hated to admit it, watching their downfall brought a twisted sense of vindication. They had destroyed my life, and now theirs was falling apart. Justice may have been slow, but it was undeniable. It was a crisp autumn morning when the call came, a moment that would test every ounce of resolve I had built over the years. The voice on the other end belonged to Mia, trembling and barely coherent. "Alex, it's Dylan. He was in a car accident. It's bad, really bad. They don't know if he'll make it through the night." Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. Not because I cared about Dylan's fate, but because I knew exactly what this meant. Another ambush, another desperate attempt by my family to drag me back into their chaos. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let her words hang in the air, heavy with unspoken expectations. "Why are you telling me this?" I finally asked, my tone cold and detached. There was a pause before she answered, her voice breaking under the weight of guilt and desperation. "Because you're his brother, Alex. Family is supposed to be there for each other, no matter what." Her plea felt like salt being rubbed into an open wound. After everything Dylan had done, after the betrayal, the lies, the destruction of my life, how could she possibly expect me to show up at his bedside? But as always, my mother wasn't far behind. Within minutes of hanging up with Mia, Claire called, her voice frantic and laced with manipulation. "This isn't about forgiveness, Alex," she insisted, though we both knew that was exactly what it was. "This is about showing some humanity. He's your brother." Every fiber of my being wanted to scream at her to remind her that Dylan stopped being my brother the moment he crawled into bed with Emma, but I didn't waste my breath. Instead, I said flatly, "Dylan made his choices, and now he has to live or die with them. Don't call me again." I ended the call without waiting for her response, silencing her cries of protest with the press of a button. The days that followed were filled with updates from mutual acquaintances, none of which I sought out but all of which seemed determined to find their way to me. Dylan survived the accident, but the damage was catastrophic. His spine had been severely injured, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. Doctors said he'd never walk again, let alone work. For someone who once prided himself on his carefree lifestyle and physical prowess, this was nothing short of a death sentence. And then came the final blow. Emma left him. Apparently, she couldn't handle the burden of caring for a man who could no longer provide for her. Rumors spread like wildfire through our small town that she packed her bags one night and disappeared without so much as a goodbye. Some claimed she moved in with an old flame. Others whispered that she fled to another state altogether. Whatever the truth, one thing was clear: Dylan was utterly alone. As news of his downfall rippled through the community, it became the talk of the town. People who once admired Dylan's charm now pitied him, or worse, mocked him. At the grocery store, at the coffee shop, even at work, snippets of conversations reached my ears. "Did you hear about Dylan? Karma really came for him, didn't it?" one person muttered. Another chimed in, "Serves him right after what he did to Alex." Each comment carried a twisted sense of vindication, a reminder that justice, though delayed, had finally arrived. But despite the satisfaction I felt watching the universe balance the scales, there was also a lingering sadness, not for Dylan, but for the life I once imagined we might have shared. Growing up, we weren't just brothers, we were rivals, confidants, partners in crime. Those memories, however tainted they now seemed, still lingered in the corners of my mind. Yet, I reminded myself that the Dylan I remembered, the boy who taught me how to ride a bike, who stood by my side during schoolyard fights, was long gone. In his place was a stranger, someone unworthy of my sympathy or forgiveness. By the time winter rolled around, Dylan's situation had deteriorated further. With no income and mounting medical bills, he was forced to sell off whatever assets he had left. The house he and Emma once shared went into foreclosure, and he ended up living in a cramped studio apartment paid for by my mother. Even Claire, who had spent years defending him, began to show cracks in her loyalty. During one rare phone call, she admitted bitterly, "I don't know why I keep trying to save him, Alex. He doesn't appreciate anything I do." Her confession confirmed what I already knew. Dylan's recklessness had finally caught up with him, and there was no safety net left to catch him. As for me, I refused to look back. My life in Indianapolis was thriving. Hannah and I were preparing for the arrival of our son, and every day brought new reminders of the joy and stability I had fought so hard to achieve. While Dylan languished in despair, I reveled in the knowledge that I had chosen a different path, one defined by love, trust, and accountability. The journey Alex embarked on wasn't just about escaping the wreckage of betrayal, it was about rediscovering what it truly means to belong. For years, he had clung to the belief that family was an unbreakable bond, a sacred tie forged by blood and shared memories. But Dylan and Emma's actions shattered that illusion, leaving behind not only anger but also a profound emptiness, a void where trust once lived. The hardest lesson Alex learned wasn't simply that forgiveness could be weaponized. It was that forgiving someone didn't automatically restore balance or heal wounds. In fact, in cases like his, forgiveness often became a tool for manipulation, a way for those who caused harm to avoid accountability while demanding emotional labor from the victim. This realization crystallized during one particularly raw moment after the disastrous Christmas ambush. As Alex drove away from his parents' house, the weight of their expectations pressing down on him like lead, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about loyalty. His mother Claire's pleas for family unity weren't born out of genuine concern for his well-being, they were thinly veiled attempts to sweep Dylan's betrayal under the rug. Joe's dismissive attitude toward the affair, a reflection of his inability to confront conflict head-on. Even Mia's hesitation to take sides revealed how deeply ingrained dysfunction ran within their family dynamic. Each interaction left Alex feeling more alienated, more convinced that staying connected to them meant accepting toxicity as normal. But breaking free came at a cost. There were nights when loneliness crept in, whispering doubts into his ear. Was he being too harsh? Could he have handled things differently? These questions haunted him until Hannah entered his life, a beacon of light amidst the chaos. Unlike anyone else in his orbit, she listened without judgment, supported without strings attached, and loved without conditions. She didn't pressure him to reconcile with his family or minimize the pain they caused. Instead, she reminded him that healing wasn't about returning to the past. It was about building a future worth fighting for. Their relationship became a testament to what real love looked like: steady, respectful, and rooted in mutual support. When Hannah told Alex she wanted to start a family together, it wasn't just a declaration of commitment. It was a promise to create something entirely new, something untainted by the bitterness and brokenness of his old life. Holding her hand as they discussed names for their unborn son, Alex felt a surge of emotions he hadn't dared to feel in years: hope, joy, and most importantly, peace. Peace because he finally understood that family wasn't defined by genetics, it was built through acts of kindness, sacrifice, and unwavering support. That understanding solidified further when Alex made the decision to change his last name. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment choice. It was the culmination of months of reflection. Every time he signed documents with his new surname, he felt lighter, as if shedding layers of resentment and reclaiming ownership of his identity. He chose a name inspired by a personal hero, someone whose values aligned with the life he wanted to build. And when Hannah joked about taking his new last name upon marriage, it reinforced the idea that they were creating their own legacy, one untouched by the shadows of his past. Looking back, Alex realized that cutting ties with his biological family wasn't just an act of self-preservation, it was an affirmation of self-worth. By choosing to distance himself from those who prioritized convenience over integrity, he opened the door to relationships that nurtured rather than drained him. Hannah and their soon-to-be-born child represented everything he had been searching for: unconditional love, stability, and a sense of belonging that transcended DNA. They were proof that sometimes walking away from toxic connections is the bravest thing you can do, not out of hatred, but out of love for yourself and the life you deserve.